Good morning, everyone. We'll give just another minute for everyone else to get online, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, good morning, all. I'm Shauna Haley, TAMIO's VP for Development and Education, and I honestly could not be more excited about today's session. We're diving deep into the Edelman Trust Barometer. Our host today for our session is Thomas Reeves, Director of Public Affairs for the City of Baytown. I'm going to let him introduce our speaker, but before I turn things over, I want to remind you that we have the Q&A function running and you can type your questions into that. We have structured this program so that there is plenty of time for conversation. So plenty of time for questions, plenty of time for in-depth back and forth. So please feel free to think through questions. It's not very often that we get the opportunity to actually have a conversation with someone from Edelman. So be thinking of things as we're going through this session, and it's going to be a good one. With that, I will hand it over to Thomas.
Thank you, Shauna. And I too am thrilled about this presentation and to be able to introduce my friend Roxana to you from Edelman. Edelman, if you don't know, and I'm sure she will give us a briefing at the beginning of her presentation, is at the forefront of this issue of trust. And it's a world-renowned communications organization that knows what they're doing, and they've been around a really long time. So I'm really excited to hear about the latest results. This is an annual survey they do, and Roxana is going to share the results. But what I find interesting about this trust barometer, especially in terms of government communications, is how we as government communicators can use this data to be better communicators between the city and the public. And so a lot of this data is going to be directly related to our role as PIOs and communications directors and professionals. So pay attention, jot down your questions, and put them in the Q&A section so that I can lead a good session of Q&A at the end of this. So for now, I'll hand it over to Roxana Ulrich, who's the Vice President of Energy at the Houston office of Edelman. And she leads Edelman's global energy sector development. She knows what she's doing. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in communication in our field from the University of Texas at San Antonio. And I'll hand it over to you, Roxana.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thomas. I'm really excited to be here. So Edelman is a global communications and marketing agency. We work with clients across all different sectors. And we've been putting out this trust barometer for 23 years. We started doing this in 1999. And we look across all sectors, tech, health, corporate, B2B, B2C, racial inequality. We have special cuts of our trust data to look at racial inequality and justice in the US. We did some deep dive reports on COVID. A lot of this is available on our website for you to just download the presentations, and I'll make sure that this one is also available for you all after this presentation. So again, this is our 23rd year of doing trust. For the first 19 years that we did this, by the way, we look across 4 institutions when we examine trust. We look at media, trust in business, trust in government, and trust in NGOs. And for the first 19 years that we did this, NGOs, not surprisingly, were the most trusted institution. Over the last couple of years, starting around COVID, we saw that shift to government as being the most trusted institution. And then in the last few years, due to a lot more polarization, especially with governments, we saw that business became the most trusted institution. So coming out of 2022, we really thought that, coming out of the pandemic, things would start to look up. But then we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the falling over of crypto, COVID lockdowns again in China and more supply chain disruptions, and then Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, or X as it's now known. As we mentioned, this is an annual survey. We conduct this survey in November, so we are coming up almost on a year here of when this last survey was conducted, and we presented in January at the Davos World Economic Forum. So we survey 28 countries and 32,000 respondents globally. Notably, Russia was not part of the Edelman Trust Barometer this past year, but they have been part of it in from 2007 to 2022. So some obvious reasons there. 23 years of trust. So the last handful of years, starting maybe in 2015 here, we've seen a growing inequality of trust and different populations and their belief in trust. 2017, we saw a trust crisis. In 2018, we saw a trend in this battle for truth as we saw more polarization start to creep in. There was trust at work in 2019, and then 2020, there was a competence and ethics theme here for trust. 2021, business became the most trusted for the first time. 2022, we saw this cycle of distrust start to form. And now here we are navigating a polarized world in 2023. We've seen a much higher level of trust in the East than the West, and much lower trust, interestingly, in developed democracies. So there are really four forces that we see that are leading to this polarization. The first is around economic anxieties. Economic optimism is collapsing around the world. 24 out of the 28 countries are seeing all-time lows, and the number of people who think that they and their families are going to be better off in 5 years. Two, institutional imbalance. So business is now the sole institution that is seen as both competent and ethical. On the opposite spectrum, unfortunately, government is viewed as unethical and incompetent. A lot of that driven by the polarization we're seeing. So business is really under more pressure to step into the void here left by government, but also to partner with government to solve a lot of the issues that are top of mind to most people. And then there's this mass class divide. People in the top 25%, the top quartile of income, live in a completely different trust reality than those at the bottom 25%. And we're seeing 20+ gaps between these two groups in Thailand, in the US, Saudi Arabia, for example. And then finally, there's this ongoing battle for truth that we've seen over the last couple of years. This shared media environment has now given way to echo chambers, as we've seen spin-offs of different social media platforms that will appeal to certain audiences more, like Truth Social, for example. This makes it harder for us to collaboratively solve problems together. So media is not trusted. Notably, social media is not trusted anymore. So we're really facing some economic fears now without a trust safety net. And as I mentioned, economic optimism has indeed collapsed. 24 out of 28 countries, all-time lows. Even through the pandemic, we actually had a stable, more or less belief on economic optimism. This year it ticked down, and we attributed that to an exacerbated level of fears on inflation, for example. You can actually see here that not a single developed country democracy has over a 35% belief that their families will be better off in 5 years. And so from 2019 here to 2023 globally, this has ticked down 10 points. So the question is why? Well, we're seeing that personal anxieties are now on par with existential fears. This is the percent who worry about each in the US. So 85% of people are worried about job loss. We've seen a lot of layoffs in the news over the last several months. Inflation, of course. And along with that, these existential societal fears of nuclear war, especially as it relates to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Climate change has continued to be a top theme, food shortages, and energy shortages. So while trust has risen a bit over all of these institutions, business, NGOs, media, and government, you can see the gap here between Business, trust in business is at 55%, which we consider neutral. Anything over 60% is what we consider trusted, and below 50 would be distrusted. And government here on the far right, on the opposite spectrum, is 42%. We also look at the least trusting countries for each institution. So the least trusted of their government, Japan, South Africa, Argentina. For business, it's Spain, Japan, and South Korea. And so institutions are essentially out of balance. Government is far less trusted than business. There's a double-digit divide between business and government in more than half of the markets that we study. So you see US here, double-digit trust advantage for business, but there's a 13-point gap between business and government. So government and media are really what we see as fueling this cycle of distrust based on the data. They're seen as sources of misleading information. So we actually asked people, these institutions, this is the percent who say these institutions are either a source of false or misleading information or a reliable source of trustworthy information. So government, 55% feel that government is a source of false or misleading information, versus business, 43% believe that it's a source of trustworthy information. And you can see media also has a significant gap. NGOs are seen as offering more trustworthy information. Trust in all institutions rises across specific US communities though. So we look at Asian communities, Black, Hispanic, and white communities. So if you look at government here on the top left quadrant, Black communities, white communities trust government the least. Asian and Hispanic are neutral. None of them are actually trusted across any of these communities, not above 60%. For business, it's across the board neutral, Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white communities. For media, Asian and white communities believe that media is not trustworthy. For NGOs, white communities believe that NGOs are not trustworthy. And institutional leaders are also distrusted in the US. So trust is really local. People believe that those closest to them are the most trusted. My CEO, my neighbors, my coworkers, these are the people that we trust the most. Who we trust the least are other CEOs, government leaders, journalists, and notably scientists, which saw a 9-point growth in trust. We've seen that continue to grow as a result of COVID. So this is a really interesting slide because it shows the mass class divide and that difference in trust realities between high income earners and low income earners. So you can see that among high income earners, the US ranks 63% here in terms of trust. But if you look on the right side, the US drops to 40% as distrusted among low income earners. So depending on how much you earn dictates your level of trust. There's 15-point gaps, 20-point gaps here. You can see the greatest income-based trust equality in Thailand is 37 points. In the US, the gap is 23 points, and on and on. And trust at home does not necessarily guarantee trust abroad. So China and India were at the top of those trust brackets in the last slide. But here, foreign trust in these companies is extremely low, 32% for China, 34% for India. Domestically, however, their own survey respondents in their country, 90% of them trust their country, 89% of them for India. So the trust divide here, the gap from foreign versus domestic is rather large. So all of this really shows that distrust is what's breeding polarization. We've continued to see a slippage from the usual constructive debate in society to extreme polarization. This means my views are entrenched. I'm no longer willing to accept a real debate. I'm sure that I am right. This is how people are feeling now. So these are the three categories of countries in the way that we've positioned them from least polarized, where they see few deep divisions, moderately polarized, they see deep divisions, but they think they might be addressable, and severely polarized. So deep divisions that will never get past. And so here you can see the least divided countries: India, Malaysia, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, China, Indonesia, UAE. The least divided actually tend to be single party or autocratic. This is not an endorsement of that form of government, simply an observation that these institutions actually have a rather even balance across their markets. In the moderately polarized section, this is where you have a more normalized dynamic with two different parties. But here we also have this like array of about a half a dozen countries that are on their way to moving toward to becoming more severely polarized. And then in the US that's in this next category here, we have the severely polarized countries, which is caused by low trust in government, a torn social fabric, general sense of unfairness. So drivers of polarization, why is this happening? Distrust in government and lack of shared identity are the largest reasons. Systemic unfairness and economic pessimism, societal fears, distrust in media. And unfortunately, the US is a great case study for this. This is a gap between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are more likely to say that our differences are insurmountable. So this is the percent who say in the degree of polarization, my country is polarized. 50% of Republicans believe that their country is polarized and that divisions are entrenched. That's 33% for Democrats. When it comes to trust in government, again, here's the gap between the two parties: 26% for Republicans in terms of trusting the government, 61% for Democrats. Trust in media, the gap again is enormous. 25% of Republicans trust media, 63% of Democrats trust media. And again, with I will be better off in 5 years, similar trends here. So in general, we're seeing that Republicans are less trusting and a bit more pessimistic. And this divide here is obviously a huge challenge for us and makes our differences now feel insurmountable. And it's both cause and effect. Polarization itself is leading to further distrust. This is the percent of trust among those who say that their country is not very divided versus polarized. Polarized, they feel that divisions are entrenched. When we see our countries polarized, we generally just do not trust. And you can see that for polarized countries like the US, distrust is rampant across almost all of the institutions. And no institution is trusted across any US region. So we looked at the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, and the West. 3 of these institutions are largely distrusted: government, media, NGOs. You can see for government, the Midwest has the least amount of trust for government. For media, again, the Midwest, least trusted. For NGOs, it's the Northeast region that feels the least amount of trust. For businesses, the lowest trust is the Northeast, highest among the West. So we're more divided today than in the past. Almost every developed democracy is in the 50+ range. 53% globally, our country is more divided today than in the past. And the US sits here at 67%. So these divisive forces are really what's exploiting and intensifying our differences. This is the percent who say in the US that these various groups here are either a dividing force that pulls people apart or a unifying force that brings people together. For all of these groups except teachers, these are each seen as a dividing force, pulling people apart. The rich and powerful, huge gap, government leaders, hostile foreign governments, journalists, even NGO leaders, and some business leaders. Teachers are really seen as the only unifying force, and so they're likely to be seen as unifiers. And in the US, this social fabric is weakening. 77% of people say that the lack of civility and mutual respect today is the worst they've ever seen. 3/4 of people. 64% say that the social fabric that once held this country together has grown too weak to serve as a foundation for unity and common purpose. And I know this is all sounding very bleak. We're going to get to some solves. I promise we'll have some solutions. But this one is a very telling slide. It's rather bleak here that the ideology has become our identity. This shows that few people would help, live, or work with the other side. 29% of people, only 29%, would help somebody who strongly disagreed with them or their point of view if they were in need. Only 23% of people would be willing to live in the same neighborhood as somebody who had opposing views, differing point of view. And only 20% would be willing to have them as a coworker. I mean, just think about how this impacts our employment, our recruiting, you know, how we live and work in communities. These are very concerning, you know, statistics here in terms of the divide that we're seeing and how it affects the way that people view their ideologies and identities. So polarization is reinforcing fears when it comes to violence in the streets, prejudice and discrimination, loss of our country's influence, government gridlock, and an inability to address societal changes. If these divisions are not addressed, it's likely to be a huge consequence. And for businesses in particular, these are some very high expectations that bring heightened risk to solve. In this more polarized environment, business action can be seen as more political, more politicized. You can look at examples like Disney or Bud Light or any of these where companies are now coming under fire for their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and programs. Trying to wade into these waters is very difficult for businesses at this time. It poses a lot more risk and a lot more to be considered. But again, business is the only institution that is the most trusted and is seen as the most competent and ethical. So while it's difficult, they're the ones who have to lead. This graph here shows the difference between where these institutions sat in terms of this competent and ethical framework from years prior versus this year. So this year would be the dark shaded triangle. So you can see on the top right quadrant, business is the only one sitting in this ethical, competent area. And in fact, business has seen a 20+ increase in ethics. On the complete opposite side, this gap is very wide. Government is seen as the least competent and the least ethical. So who's trusted? My employer. Again, trust is local. People, 76% trust their employer. And you can see this is true for all of the countries that we've surveyed, save for South Korea, which is neutral. So my employer really has the advantage here to drive trust among, you know, their employees. Again, among those who feel polarized, my employer is the only trusted institution. So whether we're looking at countries that are not very divided, not entrenched, polarized countries where divisions are entrenched, we're still seeing that as the most trusted is my employer. So consumers and employees are pressuring businesses then to stand up for them. Why are businesses the most trusted institution? It's because people believe that they can actually influence the role of business, whether that's through their purchasing power and brand loyalty, whether that's through employment opportunities, recruitment. They feel that businesses are the ones who will listen to their voice. 65% of people in the US say they will buy or advocate for brands based on shared beliefs and values. 72% believe that having a societal impact is a strong expectation or a deal breaker when it comes to considering a job. So this is, you know, business reflects my values, has a greater purpose, meaningful work that shapes society. opportunities to address social problems. It stops specific business practices if employees object. And, these are the kind of companies that CEOs address controversial issues that I care about. And people want more societal engagement from business, not less. So this is the percent who say in the US on addressing each of these societal issues, business is either not doing enough or overstepping. We really wanted to make sure that business wasn't over-indexing on these issues. So checking to see if people felt like they were overstepping on healthcare access, energy shortages, workforce reskilling, climate change. But you can see here across the board, by a measure of 5 to 1, people believe business is not doing enough when it comes to healthcare access. 3.5 to 1, energy shortages and workforce reskilling, they believe business is not doing enough. Climate change, 3 to 1. Trustworthy information, 3 to 1. Economic inequality, 2.5 to 1. So societal engagement does put business at risk of being politicized. This is just one of the challenges that businesses are needing to contend with now. This is a percent who agree that business can avoid being political when it addresses contentious societal issues. It's only 48% for the US in this severely polarized country. So less than the majority agree in 19 of 28 countries that business can avoid being political. The majority of people think that it does come down to, how they demonstrate their political views. So navigating the polarized world, we can conclude that a lot of these expectations here are not going away, nor is it going to get easier. So how do businesses actually navigate this polarized world? In the US, CEOs are still the most expected to act on employees, discrimination, climate. We've actually seen this trend of the expectation of CEOs over the last couple of years. So it's continued to stay the same, especially during tumultuous years, whether it's, with COVID or what have you. People expect CEOs to take a public stand on the treatment of employees. 89% believe that. 79% on discrimination, on climate change, on immigration, on the wealth gap. They really do want to see their CEOs act on key issues that matter to them. But business can't do it alone. The best societal outcomes happen when government and business work together. 3 to 1 say government and business must work together in partnership, and that is more likely to yield optimal results from partnership than business alone. If you look at both working independently, it's only 21%, government going it alone, 20%, business going it alone, 13%. So while we feel business has the greatest opportunity to impact this feeling of polarization, it is strongly believed that they have to do it in partnership with the government. And trustworthy information can help insulate businesses and their actions from being seen as political. Among the 48% who say it's possible for a business to address societal issues without being seen as politicized, this is the percent who say in the US, to avoid being seen as politically motivated when taking a stand, be a trustworthy information source. Stick to the facts. Base actions on science. Act on the same values over time, don't align with just one political party, and refuse to bend to political pressure where your values align. So improving economic optimism, CEOs are obligated to, according to people we surveyed, pay a fair wage, ensure that their home community is safe and thriving, pay fair corporate taxes, and retrain employees. Investing in these is the best way that people feel that businesses can improve that economic optimism. And using the power of brands to create a shared identity. So 68% globally say brands celebrating what brings us together and emphasizing our common interest would strengthen the social fabric. And that's 63% for the US. So brands have the opportunity here to bring people together around a shared identity. And finally, holding divisive forces accountable. 67% of people believe that CEOs are obligated to defend facts and expose questionable science used to justify bad social policy. 64% think that CEOs should pull advertising money from platforms that spread misinformation. And we've seen this with Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, where many of our own clients pulled their advertising money during these tumultuous times where they felt like misinformation was rampant. 59% believe CEOs are obligated to support politicians and media that build consensus and cooperation. So companies really could strengthen the social fabric if they, adhere to these. So ultimately, how to navigate a polarized world, we've come up with 4 recommendations based on this data. One is that business must continue to lead. It's the most trusted institution. It holds the mantle for greater expectation and responsibility. They can leverage their comparative advantage to inform debate, to deliver solutions across climate, diversity, inclusion, skills training, etc. But they have to do it in collaboration with government. So the best results come when business and government work together, not independent, and build consensus and collaborate on policies and standards to deliver results that actually push us toward a more just, secure, and thriving society. Third, restore economic optimism. A grim economic view is both a driver and an outcome of polarization. So investing in fair compensation, in training, in local communities to address that mass class divide and the cycle of polarization is how we can better navigate this. And then finally, advocating for truth. Business has an essential role to play in the information ecosystem. So being a source of reliable, factual information, promoting constructive civil discourse, and holding false information sources accountable, whether that's through corrective messaging, reinvestment, or other action. These are the ways that we hope that people can navigate this polarized world. So I'll open it there for questions that I will try to answer. Again, this data was conducted by our data and analytics team. So any questions I can answer, I'm happy to shoot them that way.
Okay, thanks, Roxana, for that good intro. And I'll say, folks, we've got a good group here that should be able to actually ask their questions in person. We have a few questions in the Q&A, which I can address, but then I would ask if you have a question for Roxana, we're going to go ahead and open this up to you. So please use the raise hand button on Zoom. And we will be sure to get to those questions, hopefully in order that they come in. So think of a good question, raise your hand in Zoom, and I will try and navigate to you. But as people are coming up with those questions, I wanted to ask Roxana, could you address government just as a term and whether or not your survey broke it out into local, state, or federal? Because I know in years past, when I've heard this presentation, it talked specifically about how local government was more trusted than federal government. And so can you just address that briefly in terms of what your survey either asked or found?
I did ask this question actually, when you and I were chatting, Thomas, about how we cut trust across like the government institution. The local reports that we've done in the past have usually been specifically requested or sanctioned or sponsored in some way, shape, or form. But for the purposes of these global reports and even these US reports, we don't survey local governments to that level, I don't believe. And I'll want to double check with our data and analytics team exactly like who they include in this survey when it comes to governments. But my understanding was we don't get as local as city. I'm not sure about state.
So should we assume then that the word government in this presentation just applies to all levels of government generally?
For now, I mean, until I can give you a clear response. Yeah, that's sort of how we're looking at it.
Yeah, okay. And then as we're building a couple of more people here to raise their hand and ask questions in person, I'll just ask one more before I turn it over. It seems like, from my perspective, there's a bit of a contradiction. You've got a couple of slides that say that businesses should do X, Y, and Z, or CEOs should do these things. And I think in particular, if you want to go back to slide 35. So you talk about, I expect CEOs to take a public stand on these issues. And so, and even just from my perspective as local government, communications folks, we could fill in the blank with other people in our business that could take over that role as CEO, and they should take a public stand on this issue. But then doesn't that not lead to more polarization if people feel like they're on the opposite end of the thing that the CEO took their stand on?
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges that businesses have to sort of navigate. We work with a lot of clients that have asked this very question: where do I step in on certain issues? And it seems that these addressing some of these issues puts them at greater risk. And it really does come down to sort of risk mapping against your corporate values and what you stand for as a company or as an entity. But it also comes down to, like, how does this impact your bottom line? So when we think about diversity and inclusion policies and programs, for example, businesses should be able to defend that back to their bottom line. Does the inclusion of additional suppliers across different minority groups benefit your business and being able to reach new markets or new customers? If you can defend that, then it does insulate you more from being seen as political or polarized. If the vast majority of your employees are looking for solutions to feelings of discrimination or not feeling like they belong, and inclusion, then the risk map for that points to, this is the right move for you as a company to make if you want to continue to recruit quality talent. And that's another thing that we're seeing, even when it comes to like work from home policies, for example. This is one I've seen in the news quite a bit, where companies are trying to navigate what their requirements are for employees, whether it's a fully work remote or a hybrid schedule. And what they're finding from, especially the younger generations or those who've gone through COVID, is these employees are choosing or opting out of business, working for employers who are asking for like full-time employment. So it really does come back to the business to say, what is the benefit or the risk to us if we don't, implement these type of policies? Do we lose out on quality talent and our ability to maintain a profitable business? You have to kind of determine at an individual level, from an entity and business level, where your priorities lie.
That's good. I appreciate that. I'm sure we'll dive deeper into that as we go on. So Will, go ahead with your question.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Great. But just a fantastic presentation. I'm sitting here taking notes, and about 4 times I've typed in the word "wow!" ! All caps. It's just really, really good stuff. So thanks so much. To your navigating the polarized world, your last slide, you've got some recommendations there that are focused on business. Can we assume that those recommendations also apply to those of us in government? Obviously, collaborating with government, we're doing that. Should we be collaborating with businesses more, since and it just blows my mind that it doesn't why businesses are more trusted now. But are these recommendations things that we should apply? Is there anything in the data that would show that we might need to be careful with some of these recommendations?
So the last question, I'd have to dig into the data a bit more and probe that with our data and analytics team. But in general, when it comes to trust for business and government, because business and government are on opposite ends of the trust spectrum right now, if government wants to make progress with their constituents, with policies, it does need to come with a collaboration with business in mind. And one of the things that we're seeing is some of that combativeness now between business and government. We keep pointing to Disney as an example, but you have the governor of Florida and Disney at odds. And this contributes to that feeling of polarization where, so I would say yes, collaborating with business right now, and given the trust environment that we're in, is a necessity in order to make progress on, the policies or the programs that, you care about and that you want your constituents to care about. Because again, people will trust information that comes from their employer more than they will their government. So an employee newsletter, for example, or a program that's rolled out through a corporation is going to be seen as more trustworthy. People are going to engage with it more than they would if it came from a government leader.
Thank you.
Interesting, maybe follow up to Will's question. And folks, just remember, you can raise your hand if you've got questions, and I'll make sure to get to you. But when it comes to collaborating with government, what's in it for business to collaborate with government if business is seeing this this chart and they're saying, well, heck, nobody trusts government, so why would I want to partner with them?
Well, I mean, the fact is, there's certain things that business just can't get done without government. There's policies that businesses may care about, and the collaboration, the partnership is inevitable. It's necessary. So I think it would depend specifically on the types of policies that maybe a business cares about, whether that's with respect to supply chains or I'm trying to think of policies that I've worked with recent clients without giving these away, but I think it comes down to a case-by-case basis of what are the policies and the programs that businesses care about for their customers, for their employees, and then how do you collaborate best with government to achieve those, those ends together. So for one of my clients that I work with in the energy space, they are very interested in policies that relate to the permitting process for renewable projects or natural gas projects. And in order to see the policies that they care about move forward, there's a need to collaborate with communities to approve those types of permitting requirements, requests, and that comes down to needing a collaboration with government as well, because these local leaders know their constituents the best. They know what their constituents care about. So partnering with them to discuss the challenges or the opportunities, whether it's local job creation, whether it's access to more affordable energy, this is the intersection that business has to work with government on to communicate those benefits or risk or what have you around certain policies.
Yeah, great point. Thank you for that. Josh, go ahead and unmute yourself, sir.
Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate that. Really great presentation. I really appreciate this. I'm actually working on a research paper about effective communication, and I actually used a lot of the Edelman Trust Barometer for my research. My question, or sort of a thought, one of the things that I keep thinking about is, the lack of trust in government is basically, the community saying, I don't trust people, because governments are built on people-based organizations. And I just wanted your thoughts on, how we remedy that, or if you are sort of coming to the same conclusion.
I think when it comes to trust in government, and one of the issues that we're seeing here is it's the information, it's the distrust of information, it's sort of the battle for truth that we've mentioned. The way that facts are presented, the way that information is disseminated, we have differing sources of truth and facts, and increasingly we're getting very nuanced in the way that we examine reports or statistics or data that comes out of various groups and how those groups are funded, and the level of extremism that we're seeing on both sides of Democrat and political parties, for example, in terms of their messaging, and it no longer gives a sense of the ability to collaborate or come to the center on things. Everything is very much sort of radicalized on either end. This makes it very difficult to trust government because you're going to become entrenched in your own party's view. And this is fueled by the way that we consume information as well. So the shift in consuming information that is closest to us, whether that's social media and the people that you follow and the bubbles that are created as a result, because you can, rely on an algorithm to serve you with similar views from your friends, family, coworkers, etc. But you will see fewer instances of somebody from the opposite side where you can, expand your own thinking. I think that also contributes to this entrenchment of our own views that keeps us divided in this polarized world. So it's really difficult right now with government in the way that we have moved in our political system. And I don't know what the solution is specifically for government in that way, but when it comes to media coverage, the sensationalized quote gets the most coverage, right? The more extreme your statement, the more extreme your stance, the more that there's coverage over that, and it reaches broader audiences, and that kind of contributes to it, which is also why there's less trust in media, because people are seeing that as well.
And I'm sorry, Thomas, if I can just piggyback on that, one sort of follow-up question to that. So it seems like the trust and the Pew research, lack of trust in government originates with the elected officials. And a lot of people, the majority of people, that respond to that survey say that they believe that the politicians get into their roles for their own personal gain, not for the greater good. Can we separate the politicians from the professional government, or are those two things just intrinsically linked because they're two parts of the same pie?
I can only offer my opinion, and it feels like the latter, but that's something that would be certainly worth digging into more to parse out, what are the nuances of that?
Okay, good question. Shauna, go ahead.
Yeah, Roxanne, I have a question. Stepping outside of government a little bit, over the last 23 years, have you all seen trust rebound in any particular sector? And if so, what are some lessons that could probably be gleaned from that we could apply towards pushing a better path forward?
That's something I'd have to go back and look at in terms of trends and where different sectors have, shown greater trust or less. I know in the last few years, the tech sector, the financial sectors are now seen as the least trusted sectors in the last year or two. That wasn't, I'm not sure about the financial sector, but for the tech sector, that wasn't the case always. So they do tend to fluctuate depending on, various, whether it's economic or business factors that influence the way people view those sectors. But I'd be happy to take a look back and share some of that with you.
Hey, Roxana, you mentioned in one of your slides that teachers were the most trusted source, and I'm not getting the wording right on that, and I forget which slide it was, but just two questions related to that. One, did your survey or your results identify teachers as being either part of the government sector or part of the business sector? Like, do we know where teachers kind of fit into that? Because I found that really interesting. And then I guess my follow-up kind of tongue-in-cheek question is, does that mean as PEOs for government, we should use teachers more to help us get our word out?
That's a really good question. That's one I'd have to ask our data and analytics team, is how they categorized teachers. That one I'm unsure about.
Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, it's a really interesting thought that maybe we could, just as notes for the future discussion amongst TAMIO members. It's like, well, how are we using teachers to help us get our word out if they're seen as the most trusted? And those are my words. I know you have a more fancy scientific wording for it, but I just think it's an interesting concept. Of course, on the other hand, probably one of the most challenging groups to work through because of how busy they are and how uninterested they are in anything besides the students in the classroom. So just something to think about. Okay, last chance, folks, to raise your hand and ask your question, and then we will get you on your way. I think one of the just kind of maybe overarching general question that we've danced around all morning with this is, should government stay away from polarizing topics, or is it okay for us to talk about it? Is that just not something that we should dive into?
I think it's impossible to stay away from these polarizing topics. I mean, they are, you can't not address them when your constituents are looking to you to provide solutions around this. I think it's the manner in which we approach those topics and how we are willing to collaborate, across the aisle or across businesses or others to address it. Showing more of a collaborative approach, showing that you have different stakeholders, different partners and third parties as advocates for it. Really, I think that's the driver that can help insulate against being seen as too politicized. And the advocates thing is really key, because when we, from a business standpoint, work with companies that are trying to reach certain communities that maybe have not resonated with their business in the past, like the energy industry obviously has some challenges with reaching certain communities. It really does come down to partnering with the right types of organizations, community leaders, governments, and finding those advocates and finding ways to not just, partner for the sake of your own objective, but also being able to listen and learn and take in from the other side. And actually show action as a result of those, conversations. So coming from a genuine place of collaboration can better insulate against being seen as political or, polarized.
That's a really great place to leave our discussion. Thank you for that insight. I would say I'm grateful for your time, Roxana. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Folks on the call, this was offered to you free of charge as a member of TAMIO, and we hope to bring you more like it. Roxana, thanks for pulling all this together. I will say, for those of you who have been asking, this report is publicly available on the Edelman website. You simply can go to edelman.com and it's right on the homepage, but I believe Shauna will also send it out. So I will turn it over to you, Shauna.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Roxanne. And thank you, Thomas, for coordinating the webinar today. This has been fantastic. And I know everybody has a lot of information that they're processing right now. I would encourage everyone, don't be discouraged by results that you hear. This is a great opportunity to leverage your skill set, the training that you have to be a great communicator and use communication as a relationship building methodology. So hopefully this information helps you do bigger and better work and find strong partnerships. We will put a link to a copy of the report in our TAMIO Facebook group. So another reason for our members, that's a members only access to that Facebook group. And the recording of the session will be put on our website in the next day or two. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you all join us at our September webinar. We are circling back and doing some hands-on work in AI. You don't want to miss that session. It'll be a great one. We'll be sending out more information in the weeks to come. Otherwise, thank you so much. Have a great day, and thank you for joining us.